Not this time. No, not this time. It's totally made up. Pure fiction.
We're not talking about this or this. We're talking about this.
Hey, welcome to Making the Space. My name's Pat Schuff. We will be talking about, as we have been in the past few days, 3D printers. And we're going to take it from a different perspective. Rather than looking at 3D printers and diving into how to use them, we're going to start looking at different makerspaces and hackerspaces and see how they use them. Kind of doing a survey to figure out how many printers do you need, what type of printers do you need, and what do people use them for. So let's get started. I know I personally make fun of people who go to Wikipedia to define things, but to be honest, it's a good place to start, especially for layman's terms, like what is a hackerspace, what is a makerspace, how do people define it? Mainly you're looking for how other people look at it, how other people define it, because there's a preconceived notion with what the word means. If you look at the variations section, it kind of gives us an idea of keywords to search for. Public libraries, public schools, Fab Labs, universities, private places to do things. I like the idea of a bicycle co-op or a cooking co-op, but we're focused on 3D printing in this discussion. Hackerspaces.org is a good place to start a search. In this example, I've gone and looked at the list of hackerspaces. This is a self-maintained list of hackerspaces and makerspaces, and it's not absolutely complete. For example, there are more than 20 hackerspaces in Northern California, and this shows virtually nothing in some states. So take it with a grain of salt. It's a good place to start. In this video, we're going to go through and look at a lot of the ones in Texas because I visited a few of them and am familiar with a few of the makerspaces in the Texas area. The makerspace I'm most familiar with is TXRX Labs out of Houston. I spend a lot of time there. I'm a full member and go minimum once a week or once a month, depending on the holiday season and a variety of things. When the lab first started out in its original location, there were 2 printers, and they were both MakerBot printers. And then through a grant from Prusa, they got a suite of Prusa printers, the MKS2. And on average, they have 5 to 6 in a lab ready to use, as well as some Form 3 printers. The Form 3s aren't used very much because the material is relatively expensive. The Prusa printers are used on a daily basis. There's always something printing every day. The question is, are all 5 used? Are all 5 functioning? And they've got a set of other printers in the background that can be used as well, but most of those are for staff. To generate a little bit more revenue and help pay for staff, there's a 3D production printing fabrication lab that the staff has access to, but members do not. There's a separate room that has staff-only access with commercial printers. 2 of the commercial printers are available to members so that they can get used to higher-end printers as well as the 3D form printers. There's a variety of ways of funding something like this. Whether you can support a fabrication lab is a separate discussion and worthy of looking at how to fund lower-end printers and expand the 3D printing fabrication. A second way of generating revenue for the staff is to have them teach classes. TXRX, for example, teaches a 3D printing class once a month, which generates about a dozen people into a class. And the concept is a dozen people times $700 once a month basically pays the staff for a couple weeks and allows miscellaneous and various consumables to be replenished in the lab. Another makerspace that I've visited is the Austin Makerspace in Northeast Austin. They have a poly printer and they have a Form 3D printer. And to be honest, that's all they have. They don't do a whole lot of 3D printing. It's not a major focus. Most of the users show up there to do woodworking, metalworking, and to use a laser cutter. 3D printing is not a major focus of this lab, and their consumer industry is perfectly fine with that. One of the Dallas Makerspaces has a slightly different perspective. They do a lot of sewing, fabric, and 3D printing. They have 6 of the poly printers, as well as a larger poly printer, a Delta printer, and some form printers. So they have a dedicated lab associated with 3D printing, and their user community tends to use it a whole lot more. Moving a little south to San Antonio, 10-Bit Works Makerspace is primarily a woodworking and metal shop in a warehouse. They do have some 3D printers. Most of them are Ender printers, and they don't typically highlight it very much on their website, so it's hard to figure out what they've got, what they don't have. One of my planned visits is to the San Antonio Makerspace in the next few months. Moving a little north of Austin, Waco has a makerspace that's relatively close to Baylor University. They have 5 different 3D printers. Now, the key word there is different. I'm not a big fan of having multiple 3D printers and multiple types. Having the same 3D printer is a good thing because you can interchange parts. You can cannibalize one to make the other one work. Having 5 different types of printers means you have to have 5 different skill sets to be able to manage and maintain all 5 of them at the same time. And typically you're waiting on parts, and your parts supply is 5 different types of parts that are needed to maintain 5 different printers. So speaking of universities, the Waco one is not affiliated with Baylor, but Texas State in San Marcos does have a Fab Lab that is part of the Student Union and Student Center that allows you to come in and use the 3D printers for a variety of projects. Most universities do have some type of fabrication lab. Utilimaker seems to be the printer of choice for universities. I'm not exactly sure why. My guess is the vendor is giving deep discounts to seed students into understanding this tool so that when they graduate, they are familiar with it, they're used to it, and they buy it commercially when they start a new job. University of Washington out of Seattle has a fairly large 3D printer lab with laser cutters and vinyl cutting and a variety of things for student services. They have a collection of utiliprinters exceeding like 20, and then some Form 3D printers. It's a fairly well-stocked lab. The student prices are $5 per semester, and it's charged to all students for access. So it's relatively, large, well-funded lab. Doing a quick search on YouTube for Makerspace tours, I found a few other labs that looked kind of interesting. The Pikes Peak Lab out of Colorado Springs has 5 of the form printers and 2 Prusa printers, and then some TAS printers that they've modified themselves. The interesting thing about this lab is it's open 24 hours. They have badge access that allows you to come in the middle of the night, do what you need to, and leave. Building access is something interesting. Most universities have controlled access during fixed hours. Most of the other makerspaces I've seen are business hours, evening hours, but not 24 hours. So surprisingly, there are a large number of makerspaces along the West Coast, mainly Seattle and Silicon Valley. But not much in the Los Angeles area, not much in Denver or the mountain regions. This is the Sunnyvale, which they have Ender printers, and they have a full lab of resources available and accessible. Surprisingly, the Northeast is a hotbed of makerspaces. Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York. Given that MakerBot started in New York City, it's not a surprise that there's a lot of activity in that area based on the maker fairs that started in and around New York. Akron, Ohio, for example, has a fairly active makerspace. One of the things they do that is not in best practice, in my opinion, is to have 5 different types of printers. I would primarily focus on having 2 or 3 of the same printer, and if I need a Delta printer and a flatbed printer, I'd try to go with 2 of each or 3 of each, as opposed to one of everything, because maintenance becomes a real nightmare. Printer selection is important when you're trying to fill out a lab. The questions you need to ask are, how many do I need? What's the print size? What's the intended use for the consumers or the fabrication facility? And what's the cost? Utilimaker is one that's common at most universities. Unfortunately, it's a little expensive. The Creality Ender 3D printers tend to be a little bit more economical and are used in a lot more shops. I don't have personal experience with this one, but from everything I've read, they look easy to maintain and manage and align and do a lot of work on to keep operational. The Prusa printers, on the other hand, can be a little bit more expensive with the MK3. The smaller ones are relatively inexpensive. The form printers, the higher end, higher quality printers, are moderately expensive, but it seems like that's the de facto standard in most labs, is the Prusa form printer. So up to this point, we focused on community makerspaces and have gone through a few, and universities, and given a couple examples of those. Libraries we really haven't talked much about, because typically libraries are after-school programs focused on kids. It is free to the community, but usually it's an older system. The library staff is the one who manages it. It's not well maintained typically, unless they have a very technical person running the library, and that's unusual. So seed funding is a big part of it, but very little for ongoing maintenance. The next thing we need to talk about is a Fab Lab. That's an interesting concept that was introduced by an MIT consortium of public labs that have a public and private focus, which is kind of a hybrid approach to community makerspaces and libraries. So a bunch of universities from around the world got together and said, how do we create this common laboratory? And they came up with a design criteria for something called a Fab Lab. The idea is if a professor from one university visits another city, they have access to very specific equipment, very specific tools that allows them to continue their work anywhere around the world. Now, the idea is interesting in that part of it is an open concept where you have a day or two of public access, and then you have 5 days of private access. So anybody in the community, as long as you can show you live in the community, has access to this fabrication lab. It's limited to a few days a week. Typically, it doesn't cost anything. You usually pay for consumables and not for access to the lab. One of the truly nice things about the fabrication lab concept is they give you a list of places to start. So for example, the 3D printing, they list you could get an MKS3, which is the Prusa, or get the Ender. And the recommendation is you have at least 3 of the Ender printers and allow those to be used by the community. One of the drawbacks of the Fab Lab concept is they have minimum requirements. To be able to say that, yes, I'm a Fab Lab and I would like to be part of the Fab Lab community, I have to purchase a list of things. So in this example, I'm looking at $41,000 just for fabrication facilities. And a lot of that is consumable equipment like silicon rubber, mats, tools. It's not something that is easily ventured into, and you have to get certified for multiple environments like 3D printing and sewing and vinyl cutting and laser cutting, and each of those has about a $40,000 price tag associated with it. Now, this is the equipment price tag and not necessarily the facilities or building. They also have very strict guidelines on how the building should be laid out and the furniture that's required to house this equipment. Given the price nature of operating a Fab Lab, they're typically corporate sponsored. Fab Lab Houston, for example, is backed by Chevron and a private foundation that has built a facility near the Intercontinental Airport, which is a highly industrial, low-income area, and the intent is to provide STEM outreach programs to local schools that typically don't have access to science and technology. A second fabrication lab called Idea Studios exists in the west part of Houston. This one is subsidized by oilfield services companies as opposed to an oil company. The two are very similar. They are about 30 kilometers away from each other, so they cover very different areas, but basically the same community. The A-Leaf area is a low-income area of Houston, and this provides STEM outreach programs for low-income students. Another extreme example of a Fab Lab is Dripping Springs High School. This is a fairly affluent suburb of Austin, and in conjunction with the University of Texas, Austin, they have a partnership that created a fabrication lab at the high school. This is not necessarily funded by a private institution or by a corporation, but instead through an amalgamation of local resources, high school, the school district funding, and an outreach grant from the University of Texas. Dallas has a different perspective on the Fab Lab. The one in Richardson at the workshops facility is primarily focused on camps and classes, after school type programs or summer school programs. It does not have the same resources. For example, they don't have the metal fabrication, but they do have circuit production, laser cutting, vinyl cutting. So typically hands-on type things that more kids can do than adults. So hopefully you've got a better understanding of the way 3D printing ties into not only a makerspace, a hackerspace, or a Fab Lab, are familiar with the concepts a little bit. We did look at a few community makerspaces and kind of came up with the question of what type of 3D printers do they use, how many do they use, looked at a couple of universities to see how well funded they are and how accessible 3D printing is at most universities, and then looked at Fab Labs and some of the requirements for it. Now, things we didn't talk about was home labs, how to build one of your own. Hopefully, if you're doing that, you already know what you're doing. Corporate labs, if you're part of a major corporation that's building a fabrication foundry, or fabrication labs where I'm doing 3D printing farms. We didn't cover those. Those are private access. Mainly what we were looking at is if I'm setting up a makerspace, how many printers do I need? What printers do I need to buy? And then what are the issues I need to look at? Access, maintenance, storage, real estate are all issues that come into play, as well as how big of a print bed and what's the intention and purpose for the community. Is it general purpose printing? Is it very large volume printing? Those have different needs and different requirements, as well as funding requirements. How am I going to pay for this? How am I going to pay for my staff? And how am I going to keep this self-sustaining so that I don't have to asking for more money over and over again? So hopefully this helps in a discussion. If you're looking at building your own makerspace or hackerspace, tell me what you're thinking of doing in the comments. What printers you're looking at for fabrication, how much storage space you think you need, how many printers you're going to get, and what type of printer you think would be best for the community fabrication lab.
Now back to your regularly scheduled program.
And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.